Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's Do Book Club conversation. It's our final Do Book Club conversation, which I would be a little sad about were it not for the fact that I am overjoyed to bring Alan and Louisa together. If we were going to end on anything, we couldn't end on a better note than how we build the businesses that the future needs. And I can't wait to bring these two together because I think there's so much to learn from understanding the different perspectives that come with a poet's soulful perspective and Alan's practical perspective. So there's a bit in Alan's book where he says the language we use can create a space, an environment, and a culture that's collaborative, that holds and nurtures trust, and celebrates creativity and autonomy. And that's what we're going to explore tonight. So we'll have a rich blend of poetry and practice. What more could you want? So we'll discuss beauty, stories, truth, and generosity as we weave together the practical with the soulful. We're going to work it the other way around. That's a quote from Do Build. We're actually going to start with the soulful, and then we're going to finish with the practical. And we're going to ask and answer some of the questions that Alan poses in Do Build. So we're joined by Alan and Louisa. Alan is the author of Do Build and Do Design before that. He's a regenerative designer and business innovator. He's on a mission to help businesses discover their own unique beauty. And he's collaborated with companies and institutions all over the world, including PayPal, Microsoft, Xero, and MIT. And he's spoken at South by Southwest, Hay Literary Festival, and of course, the Do Lectures. And Louisa Thomsen Brits is an author, amateur naturalist, outdoor swimmer, mother of four. She's been a restaurant and arts critic and a tribal belly dance teacher, which I think is, as a resume, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? Louisa's interested in our response to the natural world rooted in our humanity, in community, craft, and the confluence of poetry and science. So you can see the rhythms and rituals that unite and define us all. So, Alan, Louisa, thank you so much for joining us. I know you two you've met before, actually, haven't you? So this isn't the first time that you've been brought together for a conversation.
No, where was it? We met at the
we met in the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Yeah.
And we sat in the William Morris room, which had only just been recently opened to the public. And I had a very fond memory of that because the last time I sat in that room was actually a private dinner that had been organised by the Anthony Doffey Gallery that was putting on an exhibition of some of Andy Warhol's work. And it's a remarkable and beautiful space. So the conversation that we held in there, with all of that William Morris love of craft and making and everything, I thought it was the perfect place where you and I ended up having a very profound conversation with each other, which I have very fond memories of.
Thank you.
And so I've spoken with both Alan and Louisa about what we're going to talk about tonight. And honestly, I've never met two authors who there's a real bond and a chemistry there that I think you'll see as we develop, and a real confluence of ideas and drivers. Which we're going to tap into. So we're going to start by talking about the soulful side. Now I know not everyone's going to have a copy of Louisa's book, Poem Path. Yeah, I'm from Leeds. It's Path to me. I'm sure it's pronounced differently to all you lot, but to me it's Path with an A, not an R. So apologies for that. But because of that, it's such a beautiful poem that I wanted to start with Louisa giving us a little reading, actually, just so you can get a sense of how it goes. Now, Louisa, the book is a collaboration, isn't it? So it's not just you. It's Jim and Linda as well who've done the photography and the illustration. So to try and give you a flavour of that, technology permitting, while Louisa talks, we're gonna screen share. We're going to share some of the images. So we're just going to get a little sense of how Path goes, if that's all right. Are we all good for screen sharing? Good. Over to you, Louisa.
I am footfall and track, trail and trace, thread of passage and possibility, invitation, imprint of impulse, a way-worn map of memory, line of sign, scuff and shine of shoe and shod, cut, rut, groove, runnel and clod, as wheels and seasons and years roll by. I am the pace and pause of wayfarers and wanderers, drovers and dreamers, dawdlers, soldiers, artists, of ramblers and radicals, poets and pilgrims. In their tread, I follow their purpose and fathom my own. So each one of us makes our mark and leaves our wake. And all those paths intersect. The book really very much was a collaboration between the photographer, Jim Marsden, and the fine artist, Linda Felsey. We walked and we worked together and we entered into deep conversation with each other and also with the landscape. I love collaborating. I think in collaboration we magnify and we tend each other's spirit. And I'm hoping that that's what we'll do in our dialogue this evening, Alan.
What a fabulous we collaborate and tend each other's spirit. How beautiful. And I think that's one of the things that Alan calls for in Do Build is for a greater recognition of beauty. So we'll get on to that. So Louisa, you've written the book from the perspective of the path, though, haven't you? You are speaking as the path from a completely fresh perspective there.
Yeah, I chose to. I mean, I have to say, I don't consider it a poem or consider myself a poet. It was a sort of mimetic account of a real walk. Although I think it probably reads like a poem because it has that patterned intensity of language. And I gave the narrative voice to the path because I feel like we've had more than enough accounts of the hero's journey, the single strident male or female ascending to the top of a mountain and taking a godlike view. I wanted to capture the feeling of the walk and the language of the landscape and the specificity of the landscape. So really, I think here and it relates to what Alan communicates in Do Build. I think we're talking about poetics here rather than poetry, the poetry of space, of encounter and of creative impulse and embodiment and the aliveness of language and engagement and reciprocity and our responsibility to each other. So what David, I think it was David White who talked about poetry as the conversational nature of reality. I love that.
Mm. And I think that bringing that fresh perspective is, I think, one of the magical things that poets do. And Alan, I know in helping businesses develop regenerative ideas, you've had to encourage and find ways to help them find a fresh perspective on what they're doing, haven't you?
Yeah, you very much so. I think that for me, the channel into that is this framework or philosophy around beauty, but also this idea around poetry. And in a way, it's sort of the idea of bringing Louisa and I together to talk about these things. You might say, well, these are two incredibly different books, and yet actually there's something at a level of the sinew and the DNA, which I think is actually so important. So for me, I think that I could talk about poetry if that's a good moment to tell the story of
absolutely
how that first came to me. So many years ago, I was working for the Anthony Dauffe Gallery, 1988. It probably was actually. So that's a way back in the past. and we were having an exhibition for a gentleman or an artist called Cecil Collins. And Cecil's work is quite sacred, I suppose, very spiritual in what he was painting, and he was a very older gentleman. And I can remember sitting in the room with Anthony, and so I'm a very, very early days as a designer. And Anthony says to me, now, Alan, Cecil's work, his work feels like a jewel to me. Do you think you could design a catalogue that feels jewel-like? And of course I went, of course, Anthony, I can do that. And as a sort of 22-year-old designer, I went back on the train from London to where I was living and having jewel-like thoughts. But I asked myself the question, what is a jewel? Well, it's a gift. It's sensual, it's textured, it's priceless, it's a surprise, it gives you joy. It could live for all eternity. It's something that you give from one to another as a form of generosity in many ways. And so I kind of interrogated this idea of jewel-like for actually the decisions I was going to make as a designer in terms of the typeface I was going to use, the format of the catalogue, the paper, the printing, the binding, everything that would actually manifest itself as a physical representation of that brief. And at the private view, because that was one of the benefits that you got, and I've met some amazing people, on this journey. Cecil comes up to me and he says, are you Alan Moore? And I said, I am. He said, well, my name's Cecil Collins. I said, yes, I know. He said, you designed the catalogue, didn't you? And I said, yes, I did. He said, well, I have to tell you, it's the most beautiful catalogue anyone has ever designed for me. And he was 89 years of age. And it was the last catalogue anyone designed for him whilst he was living, because he died the next year. But that story really stuck with me, because as I work with businesses today, I say that there are two types of brief. There's the technical brief. So we have to make a thing. This thing has to be real in the world, whatever it is. And so we know in this instance, it had to be a catalogue. But I said, actually, we could have the poetic brief, and you can't actually, in a sense, really sort of explain that in anything other than in a form of kind of more spiritual, sacred way. But what it does is it allows you to open up your senses and your capabilities for what could be more possible. And so the poetry bit for me has always kind of stuck. And so when I work with companies now, I ask them to write two briefs. I ask for the technical brief and I ask for the poetic brief, to stretch them and to push them to think very differently about whatever it is they're creating manifests itself in the world in a very different type of way. And I actually really enjoy getting people to do that, because it gives a completely different dimension. And I think in the same way with Louisa's writing, which I absolutely love, it starts to give you there's a different dimensionality of how you're experiencing the world, how you see the world, and how you see the possibility of what the world could be through that approach. Yeah.
I think in response, because I'm sure that not everybody watching is necessarily engaged in business, but it's the business of living too, isn't it, Alan? I remember reading that Basho said that real poetry is to lead a beautiful life. To live poetry is better than to write it, and that's really what you're asking them to do, to live it.
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, we're here to talk about do build, but do design is very much about that principal reality, that the beingness is actually very, very important. And what we've lost, I think, in business, and what we need to reclaim is that full dimensionality of what it means to be a whole sacred spiritual person in this world, whatever it is we're doing, whether it's a piece of craft that we're making, or whether actually we're in the process of building maybe something much bigger. This is what we kind of need to reclaim, and I think it's very important that we do so. So I'm unashamed in asking for that and weaving that into the work that we do, because I think we make better things as a consequence of doing so.
And it is the everyday, the quotidian, isn't it? The ordinary sacred that really matters.
Yeah, so it's not a higher order purpose in that sense at all. I think that it reminds me of Soetsu Yanagi, the Japanese craftsman and potter who wrote the book Beauty in the Everyday, and I think that that's where it needs to live, and I think that's where your book kind of takes us, really. You're grounding us into a world that is sentient and alive, and it's something that I think we really do need to kind of reconnect to, and that can run through everything that we do.
Oh, Alan, I wanted to read this for you. It's my daughter Bella sent it to me recently. It's a quote by Samuel Bautista Lazzo on handmade futures, and he says, what we need to do is bring back sacredness to the markets, to the things we do, to our crafts, to our lives, to our bodies. I loved that. I liked it as a kind of tentative ecological thinking almost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I suppose the word I was trying to reach for just now was the animacy of life. Anything and everything should be animate. If you think about, I don't know, like indigenous cultures, in ways in which they think about their world, and I think a lot about Robin Wall Kimmerer's book Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about the language of her Native American culture. There's actually more verbs than nouns, and so she found that a very interesting kind of transition when you talk about a beach, but the beach is not a noun, the beach is a verb because it's a living thing. And I think we're kind of on, yeah, go on.
I was going to say that animism really confers a strong relationship with all beings around us, a life that's rich with meaning and purpose, and also with empathy and awe. And I suppose to connect to great art, poetry is a verb too, to connect to the natural world of which we are a part, to connect to the spiritual world, all move us towards an experience of the sacred, the ordinarily sacred. And I think it's something to do with embodiment too. I've always been interested in incarnation and embodiment and the ways that we respond to our beingness in the word, the sacredness of our aliveness. And I suppose by doing so, surrender to a reverence for poetics in some way.
Yeah, you're open to the world in a different way. And I like to say that beauty is a verb, not a noun. You know, I do beauty. And I suppose with the work that I do from a business perspective, there's something so much more we can offer than the materiality of creating something. So, you know, back to the poetic brief, back to the idea of, can you make something that feels like a jewel? You know, the brief is actually asking for something which is more transcendental. And as I said, I think we should be unapologetic in asking for those things, because that's then that's more meaning making. It's more metaphysical. And yeah, I see no reason why we shouldn't be asking for those things in the lives we live. And I think it's one of the crises. I suppose when I started to write about beauty, it's one of the things I felt very deeply is it was something that we've really lost. And I suppose I now I think about, and we talked about this when we met, and I talked about, you know, writing about beauty, and I said I wrote about beauty to write myself home. Where is home for me? And beauty is in that place that, you know, took me there. So that was a path in many ways that I was seeking, that would lead me to somewhere that would be more meaningful for the practice that I wanted to do, and how I wanted to share that with other people.
I suppose what we're saying is that beauty is in relation. I read a book by Baha Orang. She was she is a medic, and when she was training at medical school, she's also a poet, and she wrote this beautiful book called Where Things Touch. And in it, she says something about having a sense of beauty that exists most of all in between beings and relationships. And she undertook to really think about what that meant. And I've just started Ian McGilchrist's The Matter with Things. It's going to take me about a year to read it. But in the introduction, he talks about how both parties evolve and are changed through encounter. And the process is both reciprocal and relational and creative.
Yes, very much so. And I think it was Platonius, just to drop a name, but who said beauty is the only thing we know by instinct. And I've spent a long time thinking about this now. And actually in Do Design, I talk about Edgar Mitchell, who was the astronaut, who was, I think, part of the first lunar landings. I could be wrong, but in that book, he talks about the overview effect. And he said, you know, I'm looking out of the window of my spacecraft and I see the sun, the earth and the moon hanging in the vast and endless void. And I love saying that, because as soon as I say that, I don't know, I get kind of a bit goosebumpy really in terms of what that feels like. But he says, at that moment, what I realize is that the molecules in my body, the molecules in my spacesuit, the molecules in my friends' bodies and their spacesuit, in this spaceship, were all forged on an ancient star. We are all stardust. And around that kind of argument, as I sort of try and draw people into this idea of why this idea of return to beauty is so important, is I say that the laws of the universe are said to be beautiful. So Einstein's theory of relativity, Paul Dirac's theory about subatomic particles, how they connect with each other over time and space. And physicists say that actually the laws that describe our cosmos and our natural world, the ones that are closest to the truth of their mechanics, are said to be beautiful. So that is why we instinctively understand beauty as this place that exists, not as a thought, but as a place that is within all of us in many ways. And if I'm making that argument to business, what I then say is that nature's run the longest R&D project we've ever known. And she's created the conditions for all life to thrive without wasting a single atom. And she's learned to hang around, you know, for quite a while. So if we want to hang around for a bit longer, maybe we need to learn from nature's playbook. And that playbook is actually based on the premises of the idea of regeneration, reciprocity, generosity, that lives in all of us. And I've found the most hardened cynics, when I've sort of, you know, brought that conversation, you know, into play, find that incredibly attractive, because what it's describing is a world better than the one that we currently have. And that kind of then gets me to think about the language of beauty as something very different, because it describes this idea of joy and wonder, transcendence, community, this idea of sensuality. You know, I say that, in fact, it's scientifically proven that we process the world through about 32 senses and not 5, because they always work in very complex kind of multiples with each other. And this is a very powerful and rich place, and where we can start to think about a place better than the one that we currently have. And for me, then, when I talk to businesses about that, I say, so you have this incredible opportunity to do something that could be really transformational in the world that we live in.
So are you asking them to awaken a kind of creaturely sensibility and conscience?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be really, you've got to be very sensitive about how you do that. Obviously, conversations around spirituality and sacredness in business can make people feel a bit uncomfortable, because there's all sorts of associations. So you've got to find a way to invite them in to have that conversation. But the way that I think you do that is that you find a way to speak to the soul, as opposed to just the head, and get them to connect. So beauty for me, we're connected to it in so many different types of ways. It was Emerson that said actually beauty gets us out of surfaces and into the foundations of things, and in a sense that's part of the storytelling or the framework, the pathway to get them to see that that is actually really important to them. But I know from writing Do Design back in 2016 that people crave for that opportunity if you can give them permission to go on that journey with them, and that they feel that there's a legitimacy about what it is you're talking about and how you're presenting it. There has to be absolute clarity, I think, in terms of how you speak about it. But I do think it's very important because it gets them to think really differently about what it is I'm doing, why am I doing it, what's motivating me. I can no longer be thinking about it in a materialistic perspective, and shifting that into a place where you're talking about regeneration of anything and everything, becomes quite a powerful paradigm for them to think about what is then possible, to reimagine what is possible is what I think.
And in reimagining what's possible, I know that you talk a lot about regenerative business.
Yes.
And presumably that springs from the notion of reciprocity, and that of registration and mutuality and equality, and that, as Le Guin says, everything is reciprocal. Everything moves in two directions. Nothing is single in the universe, and nothing goes one way.
No, that's right. And we've getting people to shift that mindset is very, very important. As I said, nature's created the conditions for all life to thrive without wasting a single atom. Nothing ever gets wasted. And you can start to explain that in terms of the mechanics of, how the natural world works, and then say, this is the best design playbook we can work from. And then it affects everything that we do. And then if you look at that, that's an incredibly effective and efficient model to be working with. Whereas if you look at how we've managed our world over the last 250 years, say, we've become very poor custodians of both the natural environment and also actually the societies that we're supposed to be looking after and serving. It's
so the idea of reciprocity being returning the gift, everything that we have drawn with such greed from the wider than human world, is your suggestion that that regenerative business considers all involved, that everyone and all beings matter, and ask the people that you mentor and the people that you're writing for whether or not they have considered a reciprocal practice.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And that has to move between the practical, as well as then, the interrelationships we have with each other. So whether that's within the business, the cultural fabric of that. So I talk about cultures of generosity and reciprocity. It's also then this idea of, if we should change the metrics from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, we might say the first question we have to ask is about contribution. What is it I'm contributing to the world, rather than what is it I can take, as one example. And then you need to bring in different sort of, I've gathered over a long period of time lots of examples of businesses which in one form or another, I mean, nothing is ever perfect, but you can bring in a range of different ways of exploring what regeneration means, in a variety of different ways, and then giving them a different, a framework to operate in that I think really speaks to them. And I know that I was actually speaking at a conference at the Royal Geographic Society earlier last year, and somebody kind of stopped me after my talk in the corridor, and she talked about actually how she said, I don't actually think my business is really interested in regeneration. But what I could tell from the way she spoke to me is she as a human being was deeply conflicted by the operational nature of the business and her own value sets that she was carrying. And I see that a lot in people. And so what I'm trying to do with Do Build is to say, there is a different way that we can do so much better than what we currently have. And the language around what we use, what we say, what we don't say, is extremely important. And we can see that in, the language that, say, certain politicians are using at the moment, which is not based on the principle of regeneration, but based on something very different. And that has a huge impact on how we see and frame the world. So I'm very keen to get that poetic regenerative piece into the dialogue, on the conversation, that feels not esoteric, but to your point, Louisa, is in the everyday. This is real granular stuff that is extremely important.
Yeah, and I think it leads to a practice in a very practical way. It leads to a practice of self-restraint, of if you're considering setting up a business, or how we consume and discard, to know when we have enough, and to practice contentment as a kind of radical act.
Yeah, and I think that in the programs that we've run with the stimulus material that I kind of bring in as a form of curation, for example, I remember sort of the first time we did it, and I asked the question, literally, what is beauty? That was it. It was an open question. And where that conversation took us was absolutely profound. We ended up having a long conversation about time. What does time mean? How do we think about time? We talked about growth. What does growth mean? And of course, our world is built on the principle of, unstoppable growth. Whereas the reality is this is just not in the design playbook of the world that we live in. It's a false anomaly, and it's caused us huge amounts of problems. We talked about the interrelationships with each other. We got into spirituality, or the sacredness. We got into design. It was really incredible, just by priming the pump and asking a very simple question. And I think that the other part of that is creating the container of trust for that conversation to happen, because you're taking people really off-piste in a way. I've not learned this in MBA school. I've not done this at university. Even if people are, studying sustainability, some of the things that I'm trying to bring into play, as we've been discussing today, is asking people to connect things which previously had not been connected or had not been seen. And one of the things I believe is that once you've seen something, you cannot unsee it. And once you know something, you cannot unknow it. And the question is what is it? What is the panorama that we can create, through that dialogue and that language, where, a bit like your book in a way, it's a very, it's a small, petite thing, but actually the panorama that you're drawing and creating out of that is actually much, much wider in terms of the idea that I'm feeling as I'm reading your words, and I think the great idea that it's the poet that actually seeks the truth, in the essence of the poetry or the poem, the writing, you strip it down right back to everything that it needs to be. But what that allows you to do is to see so much further and so much wider and deeper than were you to use 90,000 words to try and explain what that means. And that's why, for me, the poetry and the beauty of the prose is just so important for people, because it goes into a different place in them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read in your book a phrase that I really liked about standing in truth, and that means not that means standing in one's own truth, too, in a kind of realm of intuition and insight that leads to responsiveness, and a sense of connection.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of a Buddhist principle about standing in truth, and it's actually something I reflect on quite often, if I'm honest. And I was being interviewed a few years ago by someone around leadership, and he kind of said to me, "Look, Alan, you can talk about all this stuff, and it's all a bit blah blah blah, but tell me practically, how would you use beauty and this idea of truth within the context of a business?" And I said, well, it's really simple. Let's just say there's a car company that makes diesel cars, and actually sale of diesel cars and is actually not going as well as they want to, and they're facing a bit of a kind of financial pressure. So there's a big board meeting, and the meme starts to come across the board that actually, if they were to lie at an industrial scale about the efficiency of their engines and the fact that actually they were less polluting than they really were, that might actually sort of sell more cars. Of course, they know that if they get caught out, that could have massive damage for the business, the brand, and it could bring huge lawsuits as a consequence of that. So I said to this guy, what if one board member put his hand up and said, I have a question to ask. Is this the most beautiful thing that we could do? And this guy looked at me and I said, I don't need to explain this any further. That's all unpacking inside of you now, because it's asking about personal accountability, responsibility, ethics, values, and thinking about the longer term responsibility that you have as a business in this world. And I said, so that is the power of that idea of beauty and standing in truth, where actually you have a different type of clarity in terms of what it is that you do, and it's very, very hard to do. It's very hard for us to stand in the hard truth in many ways, but I think actually it resolves a lot of issues going forwards, if I'm honest. Both for us very personally, I hold that as a very personal perspective, as well as actually one where you could use that on a daily basis, whether that's at a macro scale or whether that's actually in something just very small. Is this the most beautiful thing that we could be doing right now? And what does that mean for us?
I suppose that is meaning making. I often think about Viktor Frankl, the Australian psychiatrist.
Yes.
His experience of being in Auschwitz taught him that his conclusion was that the primary purpose of life is a quest for meaning and an intensification of the inner life.
And
well, we are meaning-making creatures.
We are. So there's a great book called Metaphysical Animals, which is about, I'm going to try and remember the names now, Elizabeth Anscombe, Mary Midgley, Iris Murdoch, and I can't remember the last lady's name, but they were 4 women that went to Oxford just as the war was breaking out. And the whole kind of rigidity of the academic world around philosophy had been broken because the men had gone off to war or they had to go and do other things. And so Oxford became this place of incredible intellectual volatility, in a sense, and curiosity. And the 4 women in their own rights were profoundly influential in changing the nature of philosophy being this very hard, rational way of looking at the world, and reclaiming, as the book title says, we are metaphysical animals. And so we make meaning through the narratives that we create, the stories that we tell. And it can be very easy to say that, and it's a cliche, we talk about storytelling, etc., etc. But these are very, very powerful things. There's a man in the Kremlin at the moment telling very powerful stories about how he believes the world should be. and what he's doing as a consequence of that. And I think that we need to find very powerful stories to respond to that in terms of what that means. And so their influence was very powerful in how we started to reclaim the power of what philosophy and metaphysicality kind of means. And it's, I suppose, I've always taken the position that I'm an artist and a designer first and foremost, albeit apply my trade in a different type of way, but I won't take a step back from that position, because I think that this is the place where you create really powerful things. And Iris wrote a very important book called The Sovereignty of Good, which I quote in Do Build, where she says, the good is not the name of an esoteric object, but should be the tool of every rational man. And in a sense, you know, what we're talking about here is that idea that the good can live in the everyday, in small decisions and big decisions we make. How do we bring the good into the world as responsibility? And I on this in a whole variety of different ways. I try to do it in a loving way, to get them to reconsider that metaphysicality, and that idea of good is something that should be embodied in everything that they do. And it's something I write about, and is this kind of red thread that runs through Do Build in many ways, in asking that question in a variety of different ways.
Wow. I asked one question 40 minutes ago, and we've been going ever since. What a fabulous! I told you they had chemistry. I told you that this was a special conversation. It's absolutely wonderful to hear the pair of you. And I've never made so many notes. I've never had so much underlined. I could ask so many questions, and folks, we will try and make time for some questions at the end. So if you've got any questions you want to pitch to Alan or Louisa, please add them into the chat, and we'll try and corral 10 minutes out of the next 17 for you to ask some questions. But there was something that Alan said there about how hard it, because this is all about trying to open up new possibilities. We talked about truth and the poets having a special way into truth. And Alan said that it's very hard for most people to do that. So Louisa, my question is why is it easy for poets to find that truth? Or how do they do that?
I think it's on many levels. I think it's visceral. I think that our relationship with language is pre-verbal. It forms in the body. And it is about kind of standing in truth in order to listen. We are a culture of performers, and the notion of constantly kind of individuating and performing and producing. Maybe a more poetic response to life is to stand quietly in a place of presence. McGilchrist talks about how we always encounter things by meeting them, other things, other people, meeting them with a kind of an expectation, a predetermined expectation. And so what we are receiving is a kind of representation rather than the essence of what that being, that tree, that person, that stone, that path is attempting to communicate to us, what is presencing to us. My favorite poet of all time was Gerard Manley Hopkins, and he coined this term inscape, which is essentially the essence, and the essence and the reaching out and the touching that we all wish to do. We're in a kind of state of poetic engagement, and poesis is the notion of reaching out and wishing to flourish and wishing to connect. I believe that we all have a poetic nature if we can slow down enough for long enough to
it makes me think actually of in Do Design. Actually, I write about shaker design, which listeners on this call may or may not be familiar with, but the Shakers were a religious sect which has died out now because they had a rule which was they couldn't have children, so it was kind of a bit complicated really in terms of their longevity. But they were known for making just the most amazing, well, anything from the smallest pin box to a table, a chair, a wardrobe, a house, a barn, and they believed that there had to be this harmony and this symmetry between them. But the point I make when I tell this story is just that the Shakers never talked about beauty, but they talked about truth. And so the craftsmen, in their craftsmanship, in their making, in their designing, what they were trying to reveal, and it's almost back to the poetic brief in a sense, they were seeking that universal truth. And I think it's what makes what it is they've created. It's not to everybody's taste, but their work still feels harmonious, and it still feels like it belongs. And I think that's wonderful. And I also think about, for me, Seamus Heaney, who could take, the most simple thing like, folding, freshly laundered sheets with his mother in the garden, and takes that very simple everyday interaction into something that is almost universal, and it is transcendental in many ways. And so I agree with you that could exist in all of us, and in a way it's trying to encourage people that there's a real potency in working in that way. And of course it goes back to, well, how do I know when I found the truth in something? How do I know when I've got there? Well, that's an artistic endeavor in a sense of whether you're cooking something and you kind of know, I know now that that soup is now right for me. I found the truth in terms of what it is I'm making. It can exist in a whole variety of different ways.
Wonderful. So we spent 3/4 of an hour on the soulful side of it. I want to touch on some of the practical questions that you ask in the book, Alan. And so you've got 13 design questions that can help us be more regenerative. So I want us to try and answer maybe the first one and the last one. So the first one is, does it matter? And the last one is about how you'll create a legacy. But why is it important for businesses to ask, does it matter?
Well, I think that again, there's lots of conversations and ideas around purpose, and I think that all of those have been done for all the right reasons. But I feel that this idea about asking the question, does it matter, is actually a deeper question that we should ask. So does it matter to the world? And it's back to that idea of contribution. And so if I'm working in a sort of, one-on-one, session with someone, or even if we're working with a group, asking that question about why does your business matter, in a whole variety of different ways, asks them to walk around a much bigger question about their right to exist in the world. And what it is they're going to do to really make that a true contribution. And so the mattering, as I call it, so it's back to the idea of a verb, to me is the place where we really need to start and to interrogate if we're going to use, resources, whether they're from the natural world, human resources, if we're going to use capital in a variety of different ways, and if we're going to be true to this idea of working from nature's playbook, does it matter, really is a very big question that I think we need to ask. I don't know whether that sort of answers your question, but I mean, I think that to me is sort of how I feel about it.
Absolutely. I think particularly when we're thinking about the future and where we've got to with our economies, most of it doesn't matter. It's just numbers, isn't it? It's not stuff that that matters, and it's numbers that are not taking us to a good place either. So retreating and asking that more fundamental question of whether what we're doing matters is absolutely essential.
Yes.
Charles has asked a question which kind of fits with that. So he says, design inspires us to do better, and reading the book definitely does this. But what's the case that breaks this rule? Where does design not inspire enough? It's a fab question.
Where does design not inspire enough? Well, I would say, well, my response to that is we are all designers. We all have the capacity to redesign the world. So in a sense, I would say, well, there are many examples where we see failed design. I prefer to try and reframe it in terms of what is possible, and to show examples or to have conversations where we can see the full potential of what design can be. But everything man-made in this world is designed, you know, and the sort of desire around, I suppose, do design and also do build is to say we can design better, we can build better. Here are examples of frameworks and languages that allow us to do that. I mean, I could give you a whole list of where design fails us, you know, but to me, it seems like a pointless exercise in a sense. It's let's look at this, you know, with a mindset of what we can do that would be so much better. Or you might say, you know, Charles, take something that you feel has not been well designed, and how would you design it better? And that really is what we're trying to say, you know, or what I'm trying to say in Do Build is we can build better than what we currently got.
And I think maybe when people aren't asking the questions that you pose in the book, like does it matter, you could design something that could be functional without really mattering. I guess it can take us into a dead end, couldn't it? So really all of this conversation has been about what we leave behind, hasn't it? It's about that future that we build and that we pass on to our predecessors. So how can we create that legacy? How can we bring that future into the present day as we're building our businesses, as we're leading our teams? What are the practical steps that we can do that from your perspective, Alan? But I'm interested in Louisa, in that poetic take on legacy as well. But Alan, if you want to start.
Okay, well, I think it's a really important question. I mean, we are affected, unfortunately, by, you know, a very reductive approach to time in many ways. When you think about business, you know, we have the quarterly numbers as we call them. If we're thinking about investment, you know, venture capitalist firms, they think a long way out is 10 years. It's normally 5. In the book, I talk about a company called Climeworks, which is building these machines to suck huge amounts of quantity of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And all of their investment had to come from private money because their time frame for how they wanted to do this was so much more elongated. And Jan Wurzbacher, one of the founders, said to me, he said, you know, the challenge we're faced with is we're thinking too short term. So I think that, of course, there's a huge pressure on us, but I think that we need to reframe the time in terms of how we see the world, how we work in what it is that we're creating, and that idea of, yeah, legacy is, you know, what is it you're leaving behind that is going to be so much better than, you know, had that business not existed in the first place. It could well be about conversations around succession. So, you know, we've built a business, it's been very successful, but you know, the founders want to step down, but what is it that we're going to lead to allow that succession to continue? So that's a cultural conversation then about how you bring people into the business. What are the values that you're going to imbue in people? How do you get people to think about that decision making, which is that decision we make should actually have consequences much further down, you know, down the road. In a sense, standing in truth that we had a long conversation about is also then, I think, decisions which are based upon those ideas of legacy. Will we make decisions that, 24 months down the road are going to come back and cause us huge amounts of problems? It might cause us a bit more pain up front, but actually in the long term, we're going to be much more resilient as a consequence of that. If I think about regenerative farming, that's a great kind of format and platform, I think, where we could say legacy is something where regenerative farming is actually leaving the land, the landscape, and the productivity in a much better place than if we were using industrial farming methods, for example.
And Louisa, what's the poet's take on legacy then?
I believe we're at a transitional moment, a threshold moment, and I think I read somewhere about this being an opportunity for a poetic crossing, and I believe that our legacy is how we navigate this crossing. We need to inquire and communicate about the language of interconnection. We need to be wholly engaged as citizens, and we need to recognize, as Robin Wall Kimmerer says, that we are part of a democracy of species. And we need to raise a pledge, as she says, of interdependence and choose natural law, the law of reciprocity and regeneration and mutual flourishing. And maybe relinquish some of our desire to perform and to control, and reconfigure our meaning making, and decide whether we want to make more material goods, and ultimately transcend our ambitions and exist in a state of interbeing, and positive communion.
I think really, getting people to have that dialogue, and through that dialogue, if it's held in the right way, people start to understand that there is actually a very different way, again, of what it is they do on a day-to-day basis, and the choices and the decisions that they make, the investments that they may make, and that's where I feel that we can learn so much more from, indigenous cultures and the way that they worked and they operated, and the belief systems that they had, and bringing that into the conversation, working with businesses may sound very kind of out there in some respects, but as I say, introduced in the right way, allows people to see that actually this is a very powerful way in which they can reconceive what it is they do and how they do it, whether that's in long form planning, design of businesses even, or in the day-to-day work that they do.
Maybe the day-to-day, maybe there's an element there of returning to the ground of our being and shedding ambition, and exercising humility, and listening. What
Fabulous truth and beauty from both of you. I knew it would be a special conversation. It's been incredible. I mean, thank you both so very much, just for that incredible insight and that interplay and the beautiful synchronicity between both sets of ideas, very, very different on the face of it, but actually super aligned. I mean, it's been absolutely fabulous. As a last session, we couldn't have hoped for a better one. So thank you both so much. I'm quite moved now. I'm genuinely moved. It's been wonderful. As has all the book. It's been absolutely brilliant. I've had a great time. It's been amazing meeting so many authors, so many of the members of the book club. It's been nice to hear the feedback and know that we've been able to add a little something else to your reading, because that's what it was always about, was trying to bring the books to life and help you get under the skin of the book, really, of the authors who've written it. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. We're not going to do this next month because this is it. So
well, Tim, can I just chime in? Yeah, as Tim says, this is our last book club, and I would just like to take a moment to thank Tim for everything he's done. These conversations, which, as you can tell from this evening, have been quite unique gatherings that we've all been privy to. We've had our authors meeting with artists, philosophers, cyclists, conservationists, a whole sort of raft of people that Tim has almost single-handedly, made these events happen. And so, yeah, I think just on behalf of the team and on behalf of the members, just like to say thank you to Tim, really, who's been a fantastic host. And yeah, we certainly couldn't have done it. And he's applied himself to all manner of different sort of subjects and, very creative people. And don't you dare stop blubbing, Tim. So it's been a really fantastic year, and just having the regularity of coming together every month has been really great, actually, and also reminding us, what sort of wonderful authors we've got who are, so eloquent, and that's been fantastic. So and thank you to everyone for coming. It's so nice to see some regulars, and yeah, I hope we'll keep in touch. Yeah, so yeah, great. Thank you.
Well, Louisa, I've really enjoyed the conversation with you today. Tim, thank you so much for curating all of this. Miranda, as you know, I always say you are the best publisher in the world, and you are. And it's been a real privilege to be invited in to be part of your book club today. So, from me, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
now we all have to do that wavy thing and say bye-bye.
Yes, thanks
That's the
everyone.
way it works.
Jazz hands.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.